Everybody, lovely to see you all. Before we begin our session, just a few housekeeping rules. If you could ensure you're all on mute while the speakers are speaking, that would be much appreciated. This session is being recorded as the other sessions and will be uploaded to the Tyfu Cymru channels and then posted on the Knowledge Hub within a few days. If you do have any concerns regarding this, please do email me. Please feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions, or, we're a friendly bunch, unmute yourselves and speak as well. That's absolutely fine. So today we are joined by Katrina and Claire, and she'll be focusing on selection. Following Katrina, Katie will just be explaining plans for next month's session. So over to you, Katrina.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. As has been said, this is our first session on specifically looking at selection, and we are going to look at some of the theory behind plant selection and roguing for seed saving. So as has been said, myself and my colleague Claire Pritchard, who's our horticulturist at the Heritage Seed Library, we're both on hand here to answer some of your questions, so don't be shy about putting some of those in. We'll also have some time at the end for you to cover some of the things that you're looking at for your own growing plans. So whether you're growing for seed to produce a seed product that you're going to sell, or whether you're breeding your own variety, this session really takes a closer look at the process of plant selection. We're going to be covering basic genetics, so we're going to be looking at what we mean by true to type and the importance of population sizes in terms of selection of inbreeding and outbreeding vegetable varieties. We're going to talk a little bit about the process of roguing and selection seed production, how we do that, and we'll be discussing a few crop examples. We'll be talking you through the scenario of what we mean by selection when we look at these three crops: carrot, runner bean and lettuce. So at the end of this webinar, we hope we will have covered some of the basic principles, but we can also discuss with you some of the crops that you're growing and what that selection process might mean for you. So let's just remind ourselves, growing for seed is going to require those methods that will preserve those distinctive features of that variety by controlling seed production within that variety. And that process today that we're talking about is going to be selection. So we are dealing, as we've already mentioned, in open pollinated varieties. So these are ones that are going to breed true to type from one generation to the next with a little bit of care, and that essentially means that that plant variety is going to retain those distinctive characteristics of that known vegetable variety. Pollination can occur by a number of different vectors, and we've talked about insects and wind and hand pollinating, and the seed that is produced is going to carry the genetic information of the parent or parent plants, and the plants grown from that seed are going to exhibit those characteristics next time round. However, importantly, open pollinated varieties are inherently variable, which means that every plant's going to be slightly different from the other, and that variation can be quite slight in strong inbreeders like peas, or it can be extremely noticeable in open pollinating outbreeding varieties like some brassicas. So when we looked at the previous plant reproduction webinar, we looked at preserving a variety's true to type largely around preventing cross-pollination between two different varieties. And here on this session, we're going to be concentrating on preserving those distinct varietal features by removing and roguing out any undesirable versions, any poor examples, only saving seed from the very best examples. So we're balancing their natural variability of open pollination against those recognised traits that we want to keep within that seed production. Those characteristics, they're going to include morphological traits like colour, shape, size, plant habit, maturity of harvest and taste and things like that. So we're going to assume that you've got the isolation and prevention of cross-pollination cracked, and we're going to look at those methods that will help you select those very best examples. So a little bit of a recap on inbreeding depression. Inbreeding is useful because it helps retain those desirable characteristics or eliminate those undesirable ones, but very often it will result in a decrease in vigour, in size, fertility of the offspring that's produced because of the combined effect of the genes that are recessive in both parents. So inbreeding depression, that's that reduced biological fitness in a given population as a result of inbreeding within a very small population size. So population biological fitness refers to that organism's ability to survive, to perpetuate its genetic material, and that inbreeding depression is often the result of a population bottleneck, effectively. In general, the higher the genetic variation or gene pool within a breeding population, the less likely it is going to be to suffer from inbreeding depression. But of course, that depends on the vegetable type, and a sufficient population size is going to be essential to maintain a healthy and genetically diverse population. So for inbreeders, self-pollinating crops that we've talked about, that's less of a problem, but for natural outbreeders, continuous inbreeding is going to cause inbreeding depression. So we'll be looking at some examples. We're going to look at those later on, but to give you an idea of range when it comes to population size, we could be talking 1 or 2 plants for something like a lettuce. Obviously, you'd want to be scaling that up for seed production, or over 100 plants for something like a brassica. So we need to bear all of this in mind when we're selecting and roguing out our plants so that we're left with an appropriate final population size and a diverse enough gene pool to save your seed from. So the number of seeds that you sow is obviously going to take into account the number of plants you're going to lose on the way. So you need to know whether it's an inbreeder or an outbreeder. You need to grow more plants effectively to allow for those losses. And some of those losses are going to be determined by risks like pests and diseases, the age of the seed that you're sowing and how viable that starting seed is. And as a general rule, you're going to be having fewer extras for inbreeders than you are for outbreeders. So selection in open pollinated seed production is that process which will remove or rogue out those undesirable examples and leave you with those best versions to save seed from. It's not a single event, so it's an ongoing process throughout your growing year or 2 years if you're growing biennials, from seed to seed effectively. Although there are some key traits and key moments in that process where particular traits are more significant for that particular vegetable type. So flowering or seed colour, for example. It's not an exact science. It will require some judgment call. You will need to know your crops to understand that. And that's something that we're continuously learning with every new variety that we grow and save seed from. So how do we decide which are the best examples to save seed from? Well, right from the start, you're going to be making some judgments. You're going to be removing any undersized seed before you start sowing. You're going to be looking for evidence of unhealthy or diseased plants, and you're going to be removing them as soon as you see them. So you're going to end up with, from a seed health point of view, you want to choose vigorous plants that show good resistance to pests and diseases and environmental changes. They work well in the area that you're growing them. Some plants might show a greater ability to cope with environmental conditions. So, for example, we'll be talking about forking in carrots or plants that are quick to bolt, and how that response can be managed in this process of selection. So the big question for you is, well, how do you know what you're looking at when you are growing at any point is correct for any given variety? And what is atypical? So how do you know what to save and how do you know what to rogue out? And this is really important because obviously for you as quality seed producers, you're only going to want to be saving seed from the best examples. And as described, particularly if you're growing a commercial variety that's well known, you're going to want to manage that quality to the standard for that particular variety. Now at the Heritage Seed Library, when we grow a variety for the first time, and bearing in mind we're dealing a lot with heirloom varieties and non-commercial heritage varieties in our collection, we go through a process which we call characterisation, and we produce a descriptor, essentially a definition of this particular variety with visual guides in terms of what they are. And this will give us a reference point to select against every time we grow out again. So here's an example just to talk you through. This is Skipper's Mummy Pea, one of our lovely donated heirloom varieties that we get from time to time. We got the seed a few years ago. It came with a fantastic story, a really tall tale about Miss Skipper, some kind of missionary out in Africa who claims to have been given these seeds from some mysterious Egyptian tomb, and passed down through several generations of the Skipper's family, and finally passed on to us to take a look at. Now, while we know about the story, however true or unlikely it is, we might not necessarily know a great deal about the variety itself. So we will characterise this variety. So we will record all of the detailed physical features of this variety. So although we're dealing with recognising the effect of genetics, we're not actually dealing with our collection at a genetic level. We are clearly looking for features such as seed colour, leaf size, flower colour, lots more features really associated with that. And those information fields in our descriptors, so you can see we go through quite a lot of paperwork when we're managing our seed production. This is an example of the descriptor sheet that we produce, the characterisation sheet we produce for peas. We will follow these. Now, that these descriptors are made up from a couple of sources. They're from UPOV, which is the kind of recognised classification of commercial varieties, and there'll be some very specific elements that we might check. We've also adapted Biodiversity International's description lists. So you can Google either of those, UPOV or Biodiversity International, if you are going down that route. And particularly for you, if you're dealing with a variety or breeding your own variety, you are going to need to be able to describe it if you are going to grow it again and grow it true to type according to that description. You take lots of photographs. Photographs are really good. They really bring the variety to life, and they're very easy to quickly reference colour, shape, etc. So we would definitely recommend that. And that means that when we next grow Skipper's pea, if any plants show characteristics that veer too far away from this description, those are the ones we're going to remove and rogue out. So in that way, we can make sure we're keeping those core specific features that will be carried on into the next generation of seed. Now, we are going to talk through the inbreeders and outbreeders by groups, and I think that would be the best way to explain the roguing and selection process for all. So let's start off with the easiest, first of all. So these are inbreeders. In fact, these are self-pollinating inbreeders, even easier. So we're talking here French bean, pea and tomatoes, but that can include lettuce as well, for example. And we should allow for some variation in inbreeders, but we wouldn't expect to see a large variation within a particular population. So talking population size, if we're talking about a pea, and again, we're talking about scaling this up for your seed production, we could easily start with 10 plants and perhaps end up with just one. And that would be fine in terms of population size, in terms of preventing inbreeding depression. They are happy self-pollinators. Obviously, if that happened and you were roguing down to just one plant that was either healthy or typical for that variety, you would want to be asking questions about what was wrong with the other 9 plants. You are going to be looking to select vigorous plants that follow your expected descriptor or what you're expecting to see from what you know about the plant yourself, and you're going to remove any weak examples of those. That includes those that might be more susceptible to pests and diseases or environmental stresses. So, for example, we've got here one of our heritage varieties. This is dwarf wax tomato, and it's clearly a yellow variety, and it has some very distinctive green stripes at a particular time in its growing season. We also know it's got slightly unusual looking foliage, and it's a distinctive height, pretty short, and produces these sort of fruit shapes. So we would be selecting against that. And if out of our population of plants, which for tomatoes Doesn't need to be very large to make sure they're a decent gene pool. So we tend to work with 6 plants. And again, you're going to be scaling that up for your yield requirements. Then we can afford to rogue out plants that are atypical of that particular variety. If there was considerable visual variation across the population, then we might suspect something else is in play, and that could be cross-pollination or some kind of seed contamination. So although these are happy self-pollinators, they are happy inbreeders, there are some risks associated with cross-pollination. So you do just need to bear that in mind slightly. It's easily done, mixing up the seed as well. So contamination of seed crops, that might be another reason why that's happened. We've done it ourselves where we've had a couple of pea varieties that have a very similar name. Unfortunately, at harvest time, we've accidentally mixed up our seed stocks. And of course, we're not going to discover that difference, that discrepancy, until we grow them out again. And that's when we kind of discover that perhaps we haven't managed our records or our seed stocks as accurately as we should do. So it's something else to bear in mind if you're growing more than one crop at a time. Roguing and selection of outbreeders is even more significant in terms of population size and the variability that you're likely to see. So difference between outbreeders and inbreeders, and bearing in mind there are some that are a bit of a mixture of both. I suppose I would describe them as plants that have the kind of structure that will facilitate the movement of pollen from one flower to another flower in preference of self-pollinating effectively. So that could be because they've got separate male and female flowers, something like a squash, or separate male and female plants, something like a spinach, or there could be differences in timing. So it could be that flower will release its pollen before the female flowers are receptive, or the female part of the flower is receptive, or it might be that it has a particular flower structure that makes it easier for it to transfer pollen onto an insect. So it might have different pistil or stamen lengths that might determine that. Or it could be that the flower itself is self-incompatible, so it can't actually physically self-pollinate. All of those are going to make up this group of outbreeders. And they could be annuals, or they could be biennials. So annual outbreeders include things like broad beans and runner beans, who are partial inbreeders as well. Then you've got squash, sweet corn and spinach are typically the kind of crops that we're working with. Whereas your biennial outbreeders, well, we're talking your alliums, your onion and leek, and things like beetroot and brassicas, of course. So seed selection for outbreeders, that follows the same underlying principles as inbreeders. So you're going to be trying to maintain that variety is true to type by removing out any poor examples, any undesirable versions of that variety, using some kind of reference point, some descriptor about what you're expecting to see, or what it should, how it should mature, or its habit, etc. And just removing out poorer examples, smaller versions of that's atypical, and taking them out as you go along the way. However, as we've said, outbreeders need a wider gene pool to avoid inbreeding depression, and they will require higher population size than inbreeders as a result. There will also be more variation across the vegetable variety, and that should be recognised when making a selection. So while we're not expecting a huge difference across peas and beans and tomatoes, you're going to see a lot more variability across these larger population sizes of outbreeders. So that's going to require some judgment call on your part. We know something like beetroot, for example, will have quite a large scale of variation, and you're going to be selecting back down into what is a typical features for that particular variety. You might also want to be roguing out traits that are generally universally undesirable for a particular vegetable type. So we could be talking about traits that make it less desirable to eat, maybe a high proportion of leaf to root, or flat-shouldered concaved onions, which means they're difficult to store, or something like a rather hairy version of the radish, which is less palatable to clean and eat. And with biennials, of course, there's going to be an additional length of time and an additional steps in this process of roguing and selection after that first year's growth. Now, let's look in a bit more detail at a carrot in terms of the Rogan selection process. And we will be looking at selection again in the second webinar in a bit more detail, but I will work with this particular example to talk you through it. It's an outbreeder, it's a biennial, and timing is important when it comes to selection. So although you are going to be roguing out any poor examples right from the start, from the moment you sow your seed, actually for carrots, the selection of the root is a significant part of this process in determining which actual vegetable plants you're going to be saving the seed from. And it's going to be a distinctive feature of that particular vegetable. So for us, we will grow our vegetables. We will tend to sow carrots slightly later in the season, so we won't have sown our carrots yet for selecting out. And we're going to be looking at the roots themselves when they are at that edible stage. So when we would normally harvest them to eat, that is a point at which we're going to select from them. So it is a process that we do at a particular point in time in the growing cycle for the carrot. We will dig up all of the carrots that we have sown, and we will then select down to identify those roots that best represent that particular variety that we will then overwinter and plant out in the second year to produce flowers and produce the seed. So we've got an example here. This is Afghan purple, one of the heritage varieties in our collection. You can see it's quite a distinctive variety. It's purple on the outside and it's got this kind of deep orangey yellow core in the middle. Size, specific size is not particularly distinct feature of it, although the root shape itself generally should look as described. So that's our descriptor picture in the middle. We might have a little bit more information about what the foliage should look like and kind of density of other aspects of this root. We will rogue out those that are less purple coloured. We've got some strange looking examples here, a few white ones. Those are atypical of the classic Afghan purple carrot. We might also remove any kind of double or triple headed versions that we have. And we will end up with a final version that has a great deal more uniformity. So some features like forking, well, we've kind of grown our carrots in the same environmental conditions. We grow them in our polytunnels or in open beds in the same soil type. So we're also going to be roguing out those that have dealt less effectively with environmental stresses that might cause forking or splitting or any other kind of feature. We're going to be roguing out anything that bolts for any reason. We want to end up with a nice, consistent population, root population for carrots. So here's our unselected, and here what we end up with is a nice, consistent selection. So in terms of population size, we're expecting to lose a lot along the way. So we will be sowing hundreds of carrot seed. Carrot seed doesn't have a particularly long lifespan, so we might be working with older seed. So we're going to oversow because we know we're going to lose some because they won't be viable, it won't germinate. And then we're going to know that we're going to be roguing out probably the vast majority of that crop in order to find the best examples that we want them to move on and to produce the seed. Final population size after the first year of growing is going to be around 30 or 40 roots. We will overwinter those, so we take them out of the ground. We can either pop them up or we generally put them in some spent damp compost, possibly some damp sand, cover them up in the dark, and then we will be planting them out in the second year with a lot more space so that they can grow and produce those flower heads that we will then be harvesting the seed from. Obviously, as seed grows, you're going to be wanting to produce really high quality seed, and this whole process you're going to be trying to evaluate and account for all of this variability. So you've seen with the carrots, strong outbreeders, large population size, highly variable when it comes to seed production. But you're also going to be trying to take into account other things that might be happening with your growing. And of course, I'm talking here about spotting cross-pollination or an off-type. when I'm talking about spotting cross-pollination, I'm talking about the seed that you had in your hand at the start of the growing season. You may have received it from somewhere else, you may not have grown it previously. So you're having to make a judgment call on whether maybe that seed had already cross-pollinated as you're going through this growing process. With highly variable open pollinated varieties, clearly this is not an exact science. You're going to need to know about your variety to understand whether what you're seeing is typically a bit of variability in the population, or whether it is in fact evidence of cross-pollination. We have to rely on visual clues, background information. We keep really good records. We make a note of any problems that we might have encountered. So if you're growing and saving your own seed and you're resowing it, it is important to have a record of what happened in that particular year. So signs of cross-pollination, as opposed to just a bit of roguing out variability, is it could be that you have a significant proportion of vegetables that just don't look like the characterising information, even if you account for the fact that they are going to be very genetically variable. It could be that there's more than one thing going on. So it's not just that there seems to be a lot of variation in the flower colour. It could be that there's a lot of variation in flower colour and something else that's happening. You might already have some background information about how that seed was produced previously that might give you some clues. So we know, maybe you're aware of the fact that you had isolated it, but at a key flowering moment, you had a storm and the isolation covers blew off for a period of time. That might raise some suspicion about whether what you're looking at is evidence of cross-pollination or not. So I'm going to just talk through a runner bean example here, just to give you a feel for the kind of judgments that we have to make when we're deciding whether something is to be selected out, rogued out, or whether in fact it's evidence of cross-pollination. So this one on the left-hand side, this is Jessex longan. It's a variety known for being long, a long-podded runner bean. And we decided to sample grow out 10 plants. Now, for seed production, we would normally be growing, at least 20, 30, 40 plants even for a runner bean. But because we wanted to look at this a little bit more closely, we'd had some suggestion from the records that the donor may have not isolated their crops. Maybe we were aware that they might have grown it on allotment, or they weren't very clear about how they'd grown it and whether they'd implemented any isolation. Bearing in mind with something like a runner bean, they will easily cross-pollinate. They need an isolation distance of at least half a mile from another variety. So we grew out 10 plants. One of the plants produced bi-coloured red and white flowers instead of red flowers. We were growing it for observation, so we continued to grow it through its entire life cycle. But we got to the pod stage. The pods across all 10 plants, even the one with the different flower colours, were pretty similar. They were what we're expecting to see. And by the time we had gone to full harvest and grown the pods out and podded the pods, they were pretty consistent too. So we were happy to accept that difference in flower colour in that one plant. We were happy that it would not have that was not evidence of cross-pollination. Having looked at the records again, a bit more background information suggested it was fine. And as a general threshold, we can be satisfied with open pollinated. Again, it depends on at what point and what crop it is. But for a runner bean, something like a 5 to 10% variability we can manage. So that one plant in 10 and just the flower colour, along with all the other information that we've gathered, we were quite happy. We could regrow that, and we could actually save the seed from that population of 20 or 30 next time we grow it. But it's useful to note that some characteristics, especially flower and pod colour, are related to other things like plant maturity. So another example here to sort of kind of inform that, this is Mr. Grief's brown flowered broad bean. In fact, the flowers are purple early on, and it's not till later in the growing season that the flowers will turn brown. So we need to know that, because we don't want to rogue them out or abandon the crop because all the purple flowers have appeared and this is not what we're expecting. Similarly, again, the flower colour may differ depending on the age of the flower. So it might, we might be expecting purple, and an older flower may appear slightly differently. Similarly, if you're growing something that's got some kind of distinctive features associated with them, so we've got this kind of maroon marked runner bean variety, those markings may not appear until later in the growing season, and it might be associated with when you eat them. So again, there'll be other things that you need to consider before deciding whether something is off type and whether you need to rogue it out. This selection, rejection, roguing process continues all the way through the life cycle of seed production, right the way through to the harvest stage. And unfortunately for us, sometimes we don't really get to discover whether a variety is cross-pollinated previously until we've actually podded them. So a couple of examples here. These are French bean variety, and this is showing an example of seed coat inversion. For that variety, it's fairly typical. So essentially, it's reversing the colours for the seed itself. That's not an evidence of cross-pollination necessarily. If it's typical for that variety, it's quite common and doesn't demonstrate that there's been some issue. On the right-hand side is a black-seeded runner bean, and we would be highly suspicious had we got through the process of growing to pod these and find that we've got what should be black-seeded with some smaller off-shaped and off-coloured seeds in there. Again, depends on the scale. You are always going to get some variability, and that variability will always be evident throughout its growing year, including the seed coat itself. So you could just, if this was just one or two in a much larger crop of seed, and the vast majority are as you expect to see them, then you might, with some knowledge about how you've grown it or how it was previously grown, accept the fact that that's just some slight variation. In fact, for something like black-seeded runner beans, there's such a small genetic change in the information that determines whether it's black-seeded or not. It might be quite typical that it will be slightly unstable and will throw out non-black-seeded seed at some times. But for this proportion, we've got 2 out of 10 or something, we would be highly suspicious. This is a high proportion of not typical seed, and we would be looking very closely, just like we did with Jessex longan, to see whether there's evidence that cross-pollination has occurred. Because what you're looking at is evidence that cross-pollination occurred in the previous generation. So this is determined by what happened when the seed was produced, that you sowed at the start of the year. And again, we would always emphasise, if you are growing something, if you have a variety that is of value to you as a seed producer, we would always recommend that you keep and maintain more than one generation of seed, so that you can literally leapfrog back over the problem year in order to get your seed tree to type. So finally, we're going to take a look at an example with a lettuce. So this is a fictional lettuce, but one that we could typically have received in the Heritage Seed Library. I'm talking here at a very small scale, but of course for you as seed producers to scale, you'll be talking about larger numbers of plants here. But hopefully this will kind of demonstrate the process of selection and roguing that we need to consider, and build on all the knowledge that we've acquired over the session so far. So this is a red splash lettuce in this particular scenario. We know that the seed is good quality, but by the time we've received it, or by the time we've got round to growing it, the seed itself is about 8 years old. But we've got some characterisation information. Maybe we characterised it ourselves, or maybe it's a commercial variety, ex-commercial variety, where we've got some good descriptive information about what it should look like. So we know that it's a kind of loose leaf lettuce. It's got distinctive red spots on green leaves, and lettuce has perfect flowers. So it's one of those easier crops that we've talked about previously. It has quite a short isolation distance, only about 8 meters. And because it will happily self-pollinate, we know that we don't need a very large population size. So if we end up with 1 or 2 plants, if this is the last packet we have, and which it can often be the case when we're dealing with unusual heritage varieties, then we know we can get down to 1 or 2 plants and still maintain that biological fitness. We're not going to be suffering from inbreeding depression, and we know that we're going to be able to save the seed from it. So germination rate, something to think about when you're planning how many plants to start sowing. You don't want to have to keep going back and re-sowing if you can avoid it, if you know the quality of the seed that you've got. So it's 8-year-old seed, but for lettuce, we know seed is pretty good for at least 7 years if it's kept in ideal storage conditions. So if you know it's been kept well, or if you're not too sure, you're going to accommodate that in your initial sowing plans. Pests and diseases, well, you are going to lose some along the way. And lettuce in particular, if you have grown it before and you have a knowledge of this particular variety and the kind of head it will produce for seed production, it could be susceptible to something like botrytis, for example. So you need to allow for some losses. Your cultivation methods when it comes to growing for seed are going to account for that as well to give it the best success. So here's our example. Again, scale it up to your requirements, but we're going to be sowing 8 to 10 seeds from this packet. We know maybe some of them are not going to germinate, but actually germination is pretty good. Somewhere along the way, we need to rogue out 2 plants, unfortunately with botrytis, which is not unusual. And then we're roguing out 2 plants that have bolted much earlier than we expect. So the process of growing seed for lettuce for seed, we are trying to grow along a very long growing season. Lettuce will bolt, but what we're looking for is evidence of consistent growing habit. So those 2 plants that will have bolted, they've done that before we're expecting the overall population to start producing flower heads to do that. So we're going to rogue these out. What we don't want to do is to save seed from a bolted plant, and that's because they will have a tendency to bolt. The seed that's been produced from that plant that you've saved, that too will have a tendency to bolt, and that will repeat that process. So of course you're growing for seed because you want to grow a product that people want to grow to eat. You want to avoid a bolting situation with that particular variety. When the plants are mature, then you're going to be looking at the characterization information that you have. So we looked at our characterization sheets for peas, for example. You may well have photographs, or you may have more detailed descriptions about how this plant should look. We know it's a kind of loose leaf lettuce, but we'll also be looking at the distribution of red splashes on this particular variety. We rogue out one that doesn't have any red spots on its leaves at all, and we're left with 3 plants, and we decide to just save seed from the 2 of the healthiest plants. One of them is not looking quite so great, and that's where we save our seed from. Now obviously you're going to be working for scale. For something like lettuce, actually you don't need a huge number of plants to be able to produce a high yield of seed. In fact, a single plant can produce thousands of seeds, and is one of the really good seed producers in a relatively small space. But you definitely want to be able to factor in all of those elements as part of your selection process. So we've covered those points. Obviously, as you get to the harvesting stage for your seed, you are going to be looking quite closely at the quality of the seed that you save, because after all, it is either going to be seed that you sow again, or it's going to be seed that you are going to be making available for distribution through your commercial activities. So you are going to be removing any damaged, undersized seeds. You're going to be checking evidence for viable seed, and you might be using a winnower, depending on the size of seed and what you're growing as a crop, in order to do that. So things like squash seed and cucumber seed, if it's particularly flat, you'll know that there's not going to be viable seed content inside. And you'll want to be checking for things like pests and diseases. So you want to be preventing things like bean weevil issues that you might have in your board beans by freezing them. and making sure that they're suitably dried in order to do that, as well as tolerating some of those variabilities at that seed stage. So I'm going to pause there. I think we've covered the key crops that we were looking at this afternoon, and open it up for any questions.
I've got a question.
Excellent. Far away.
With carrots.
Yes.
If you've got a lot of wild carrot or cow parsley close by, which in the rural economy we all have, but can you still do carrots, or is it a risk?
It is a risk. So we're talking here about the wild carrot. That's the risk.
Parsley is okay, is it?
Yeah. So you're looking at just the wild carrot variety, which is the one that will cross with it. I think we might have sent some information out about the alternative names for wild carrot that you need to bear in mind that might be around. And because of that, yes, you need an isolation distance. I think it's of around something like 1,000 meters from any wild carrot varieties. If you find you are in that position, so if you're in the first year, of course, growing, because this is a biennial crop, in the first year, you don't need to worry about that. What you're going to be doing is roguing out anything that bolts anyway. So there's going to be no flower production in that first year. So you could grow out in the open in the first year, barring any other pest and disease issues that you need to bear in mind, until you get to that selection process. So we talked about digging up those carrot roots and selecting down from what's likely to be pretty variable down to those perfect examples that you want to save seed from. You can do all of that in your first year, however close you've got any wild carrot varieties. But it's the second year, that second year where the root will then produce flower that will set for seed. That's when you've got to have some kind of intervention if you think that is growing nearby. And what we do is we will produce, and they're self-incompatible flowers as well. So you're going to be introducing some kind of pollination method, which could be a brush. So you want to isolate them under mesh. We use polytunnels, easier for us to get around in. You're going to have that second year population of roots, ideally around 30 of them that you've planted out and protected from any pests and diseases and cross-pollination risks. And then you're going to introduce those pollinators. Now, we generally use blowflies from an angler's shop. Forgive me if I've repeated this before. So we go out and buy them maybe a couple of pints or something like that worth from an angler's shop. You allow them to pupate and then hatch within that space. And they will kind of accidentally, but relatively effectively, pollinate those flower heads for you. Otherwise, you can use a brush method, but I would say that's less effective. I've got Claire here on site. Claire, did you want to add anything to that? Given you're often doing the hand pollinating and the introducing the pollinators side of things.
Just before you do that.
Yeah, sorry, Alison. Yeah, sorry.
That applied to parsnips as well, with wild parsnip nearby.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, carry on, Claire. Did you want to jump in and add anything to what I've just said?
In terms of hand pollination, the more often you can do it. So if you're able to, if you are going to hand pollinate and not use blowflies, if that's a bit difficult, you won't get as many seeds set, but you will get some. And I think doing it as often as you can, so it makes it far more successful. Because if you think about it, a bee or anything else with a hoverfly on there is going to be doing it most of the time. So often is a good way to have more seed set. And also the height. So once carrots are in flower, they can reach up to about 1.5 meters tall. So if you're using an isolation net, make sure that it can accommodate the height and that the flowers aren't touching the net, because pollinators can actually pollinate through the net as well. Some pollinators can anyway. And also they need a little bit of air and space between them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And we do, you know, in terms of seed quality, often it's those primary umbels for something like a carrot that will produce the best seed. So again, you know, when we're growing for seed, we might, once the secondary, tertiary umbels have been produced, they will be smaller. We might make a judgment call on which of the flower heads that we want to save the seed on. So the big primary flower heads are the ones that we would prioritise. And again, if that's the route that you go, you might want to accommodate that in your population size as well.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm growing radishes, and so when they're at maturity, I'm going to dig them up and I'm going to rogue out the ones that I don't want. And
Yeah.
then when I go to replant them, I see some people snip off the leaves. Is that a usual practice, or how do you go about it?
Claire, do you want to jump in on that? Because we did radishes a couple of years ago now, I think.
Yes, so yes, that's exactly right. Because when you're up the radishes and replanting them, you're disturbing some of the roots or breaking off some of the roots, even if you're really careful. So while they're re-establishing, they're essentially a little bit like a cut flower in that they need a lot of water. Mm-hmm. And by dipping off some of the leaves, you're actually reducing the amount of water that gets lost through the leaves. So yes, that's a really good idea to do that, and to give them a lot as well.
And give what was that last bit, sorry?
And give them a lot of water as well.
Until a lot of water. Okay. Yeah. What kind of height do you cut at?
Something like a half would be fine, or you can cut the outer leaves off if you want to do it a different way and leave the smaller.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. And in terms of population size, so for a radish, and we're talking here about annual radishes, not ones that we would. So we tend to deal with a classic salad radish rather than a winter radish in our collection when we're growing. So in terms of population size, they are of the Brassica family. So again, the more population, the better. But you can get away with maybe 20, 30 radish roots that you're going to grow on for seed production. As a result, so not quite as big a population size as some of the brassicas, like cabbages, where we're talking about 100 ideally for seed production. But because it's an annual, and the way that it's the population size that you need is a little bit smaller.
Great, thank you, and with a fair amount of spacing as well. Yes,
so they're going to grow quite tall. They're going to grow, at least a metre tall, and produce those sleek pods that you're going to be saving at the end of it. So yeah, a little bit of space is good. You want them to be able to dry as much as possible on the plants before you harvest them, so that you've got as crispy pods if you can before you pod them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned, next we've got a second selection webinar to do with you. This is always a little bit tricky, of course, because normally we'd be a lot more comfortable standing in a field pointing at beetroot and showing you how we do it. It's a little early in the season for us to do that with this kind of selection webinar, but the second webinar that we're putting together at the moment, we're going to try and bring in some of the examples of the things that we're doing this year to perhaps bring it to life a little bit more, bearing in mind that we can't all be standing together to do that. So we'll be looking at our activities this year and sharing them with you, so that we can bring some of those principles into life in terms of what we're doing this year.
Are there any more questions?
I'm sorry to ask again. I've got a frilly red mustard in the polytunnel, which I've got about 6 plants. And they've all produced lovely pods with quite big seeds in them, but they're still green. And they're going to take ages to go brown and crispy, but they're kind of in the way now for the tomato. Could you pull them up and just hang them somewhere to go crispy, or would you have to try and plant them somewhere, or what would you do?
Well, I'm going to attempt to answer it a bit, and then I'm going to ask Claire if she's got a slightly different view on that. But I think one thing to bear in mind with population size, I would say 6 plants is a little small, but to be honest, why not? If you've got them there, grow them. The general principle is that the more you want to get the plants to their natural maturity in terms of seed production. So ideally, you want to keep those pods growing for as long as possible, so that they will actually mature. If you harvest them too soon, and the seed inside is not going to be mature. But if they're on the way and you can dry them further, then that's something that we sometimes do. Claire, do you have a view on that? Because I'm just thinking of timings and growing seasons for that particular crop. You don't want to be picking them when they're too immature, but Claire, feel free to jump in if you've had another view to add to that.
No, I think I generally agree. I think it's quite hard, really, just by looking to tell whether they're mature. I think if they're just starting to go yellow, it's a sign that the seeds are mature, and now the moisture in the seed case is now leaving it, so it can dry off. So if you're able to leave them, just if they're slightly going yellow before you take them up, if you really do have to take them up, that's a good indication, I think. And if you're able also to, I don't know how it looks for you, but if you're able to limit the amount of water they have now, because they don't actually need any water, they're drying off, that might speed the process up a little bit. But obviously if they're outside, that's going to be tricky. So
they're in a tunnel. So.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've got drip irrigation. If you haven't, perhaps if you can not water them or have any water on them, it might speed it up a bit as well for you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Alison.
I don't quite understand about the radish population size. If a brassica's 100, why should a radish just be 20 or 30?
Well, there will be some variation between different crop types. So radish isn't the same species as the cabbage, so there'll be slightly different requirements. And we're dealing here with an annual rather than a biennial, as an example, contrasting crop. It's really about how much, we do find actually that radishes will be highly variable. So you are going to be sowing quite a lot to start off with before you select down to maybe 20 or 30. It's about whether they can tolerate that kind of inbreeding process within that population size. And commercial sort of descriptions and the kind of advice that we work with suggests that population size can be slightly smaller for that radish. Our general rule is the more you can grow, the better, because you're going to be creating a much more vibrant gene pool. Bearing in mind that because those flowers are self-incompatible, in order to produce that seed, there is going to need to be a transfer of pollen from another flower in order for that seed to be produced. The bigger starting point that you can have to do that, the better. So if you can do more than that, you can. But for radishes, for those summer radishes that we grow for seed, that population size seems to work reasonably well without any issues around inbreeding depression. If there were issues around inbreeding depression because we picked the wrong population size, then that would be evident in future growing. It'd be less vigorous, they kind of run out of steam, they won't be quite right, and there'll be some decline in that population, that variety as a consequence. But that seems to work quite well for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a question. Going back to can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Alice.
Yeah. Going back to our simple pea self-pollinating inbreeders.
Yes.
So we've got our peas growing out, which is going to be the peas we'll be harvesting from. I've kind of got an eye of like where in the row there's some that look the most vigorous. But I haven't done anything different yet at the moment. And I'm just checking basically that just in terms of this selection process, as long as we're picking from an area that seems vigorous, obviously you can't necessarily tell which plant the peas are from, or they're planted very close, they're going to be climbing all together.
Yes, yeah.
We can harvest, we just need to choose where we're going to leave the ones to dry.
Sure.
Plant.
Yes.
So we should choose a section earlier on in the season to give them longer to dry that we're not harvesting from that look healthy, or
yeah, so there's a couple of things. So if you're planning to grow a crop but you're not necessarily wanting to save seed from every single plant, ideally and obviously what you're doing is quite correct, so you're looking out for examples that seem to be growing really well where you grow. obviously open pollinated varieties, they're going to be, every plant's going to be slightly different. There'll be a slightly different response. Assuming the seed isn't mixed up in any other way, what you're looking at is some plants are doing really well, some plants are doing fine, but not as wonderfully well. So it makes perfect sense. You're absolutely right to be saving seed from the best examples that work well in your growing conditions. And if you want to end up with a crop that works for that, we would recommend saving seed across several plants rather than just saving seed from one plant. But you might have a bigger,
probably, won't it? Because it's hard to see always the.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. So in terms of your seed saving, are you saving this for your personal use?
This is just for us, yeah. This is really beginners just playing for now.
Oh, fair enough. In that way, in that case, you can afford to kind of experiment a little bit with what you're growing. And okay, we have the same thing. We have plants growing into each other, and you're never going to be exactly precise about the pods. You can mark up your plants in advance. It might be a bit easier to see when they're actually at that drying stage. And I'm assuming you're going to eat the rest, the stuff that comes along, or disposing of when you're not.
Same members again.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So that's fine. So you're selecting out. You're selecting out throughout that process. So yes, look for the ones that work well. You want to be saving seed from the very best examples. You've accounted for everything else, and you're going to be keeping an eye on those. If you're growing outside, obviously just keep an eye out for pests and diseases, things like pea moth and things like that, which might be an issue. And of course, when you get to the stage when you've got those plants, they look like they're dying back, they're really drying out, and you've got those pods drying and forming again. Because we're trying to grow to as long a growing season as possible, you're going to have to deal with the weather. So you might have to make a judgment call on when you pull up those plants and take them inside and dry them off a bit further, for example. Claire, was there anything I haven't covered that you'd like to add to that as well?
Well, just in my experience, in terms of whether a plant is vigorous or not, it's probably quite obvious early on. So, and it may also be that you've got lots of vigorous plants and you've sort of spoiled for choice. But in terms of whether something, it tends to happen when they're younger, so it's more obvious. It would probably happen before they've all started to go into each other. So if they're all growing really well, then
there's just sections along the line. I've got an eye like, okay, that looks like a good section. So
yeah, that sounds fine. But yes, in terms of, it tends to be sort of growth from seed to to when they start growing, really, when it's really obvious that they're not doing so well. I think it might.
They sound like very happy peas, Alice. Yeah, so I think you're going to be. I think you'll be fine. Yeah. Once you've selected them, that's great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any more questions in the chat box, or anyone wants to unmute? Otherwise, we may have covered everything for you this session. And again, we'll be revisiting this next time and looking at some crops that will work for the selection process and revisiting some of these themes.
Hi, can I just ask one more thing about the peas?
Yes, of course.
Hi. So when you're saying like if you're eating something, so again it's just for personal use, so if you're eating some of the peas and then planning to harvest others, should you decide on separate plants? So can you eat some off a plant and save some, or if the seeds that are being saved, should they all come from, should that whole plant be left alone and then you just eat from other plants?
No, that's fair enough. I think our recommendation would be, obviously subject to roguing out stuff that you don't want to save seed from. We would always suggest, because each plant's going to be slightly genetically different, and we like that about open pollinated plants. It means you've got different genetic information, makes it quite a robust and healthy gene pool. We would suggest, if you're able to actually leave pods across several plants rather than leave one plant and save all the pods from that. But if you did end up doing that, that wouldn't be the end of the world, because they're happy self-pollinators. You could rogue down to just one plant if you needed to. But our recommendation would be, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of genetic diversity and gene pool across different plants, then we would always recommend, if you can, find those pods that look good on several plants and save them from there. And of course, you just have to bear in mind that, again, going back to that natural maturation phase, you want a nice long growing season. So of course, bear in mind, it's going to be those pods that have been allowed to have enough time to flower, produce pods, and mature to a dry seed pod that you're going to want to be saving. So you just need to bear in mind, if you're succession picking and flowers are reappearing and you've got more generations of pods appearing, actually it's the ones that you have enough time to grow to full maturity that the ones that you're going to be saving seed from. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And the first sort of succession batch are all flowering now, so I'm thinking it's probably wise to use those ones as the ones that I'll be harvesting rather than the later succession.
It could well be, you know, you might find you just don't have a long enough growing season otherwise. I mean, peas are pretty good. They're the first things that we will harvest, so at the seed library, so they've got quite a short growing season, so you might have a bit more flexibility. But yes, as a general rule, you want to keep that as wide as possible, that growing season as long as possible. And if you end up with a ropey end of season and lots of poor weather that force you to harvest your plants, or you know, you might want to make sure that you've given yourself the best chance of having a decent length of growing season for those pods. But they are relatively quick seed producers when it comes to compared to other crops, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
Matilda, did you have another question?
Hi, yes. I was just wondering again what the website was called where the variety reference lists were.
Yeah, so I would recommend, we like I said, we use a kind of combination of features because of course, you know, we're quite detailed in our approach because of course we're managing very specific varieties that might not otherwise exist, so we do need to take a little bit of care. And of course you might be comparing them with varieties that are already commercially available, which is not really our bag. We're on conservation, so we look at UPOV, so UPOV is one source, but actually I would generally recommend Biodiversity International. So if you Google that, you'll see that there's a whole series of descriptors, and they're set up to help people describe their crops in a standard way. But UPOV is the very kind of strict way of describing crops that form their description for commercial varieties. And for us, we're just trying to make sure that what we're growing is something a bit different. We pick and choose what we think are useful features. And for some things, flower colour, root colour are going to be more significant than others. We don't do the full UPOV descriptor. There's just lots and lots of features.
Very detailed.
Very detailed. So we just want to, you know, we're just looking at what makes this variety unique and how can we describe it in a way that's meaningful when we're comparing it to other varieties in our collection, and for it to be a decent, quick guide when we're out in the field deciding whether it's typical or not.
Great, thank you. I'll have a look at those.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Thanks, Katrina and Claire, for another interesting and informative session, and thank you everyone for attending.